Next story is the story of the bouncing ball. Bouncing, let's say you've got a football. If you throw the football on the ground, it'll go do, 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 do. Right? It bounces. That's to bounce. When you drop something and it hits the floor and comes back up again, that's to bounce. So, if you throw a tennis ball at the ground, it will bounce. If you throw a football at the ground, it'll bounce if it's full of air. So, the bouncing ball story. This is definitely a freaky story and something which I've sort of thought about again recently after sort of putting it out of my mind for quite a long time. And it still disturbs me, even though I don't really want to believe it. And I sort of didn't want to believe it at the time either. But thinking about it now, I don't know how to explain it. It's very weird. So, as you may know, I went to university in Liverpool, and I lived in Liverpool for 4 years. The first year I spent in student accommodation in a big residence full of people. Okay, in the second year, me and a group of my friends left the student residence, and we found a house in a neighbourhood of Liverpool called Tuebrook, near West Derby, and we found a house which was a very big house. It had 4 floors, a basement, 7 bedrooms, a big kitchen, big living room, and it was an old house. And one of the strange things about this house was that it was on a street of terraces. So terraced houses are all connected. You see these terraced houses in English streets, long rows of houses that are all connected. Well, this street that I lived on, it was Russian Drive in Liverpool. This street was full of terraces, rows of terraces. But then there was one house in the middle of the street that was on its own, just separated, so it had no houses connected on either side. This one big house, 4 floors. That was the house that we lived in. It was number 14, Russian Drive. Just this one house on its own. Apparently, the reason it was on its own was because it used to have another house connected to it, but that house was destroyed by a bomb which landed on it during World War II, because Liverpool was quite heavily bombed by the Germans during World War II, and lots of houses around Liverpool were destroyed by bombs, including the house next door to this one. So probably a bomb would have landed directly on it or nearby, and it would have been destroyed, and maybe even all the people living in it killed. I don't know if that has any connection to the story, but certainly it's just a bit strange because there was this house on its own. It used to have like a twin house next to it, but that one had been destroyed in World War II in a bombing raid. So anyway, we moved into the house. It was great. We had our own house. It was brilliant. I was with some friends, all living in this house together. It was great fun. But there were some strange things about living in this place. Well, one strange thing in particular, and that was that people who lived at the top of the house, on either the top floor or the floor below, would complain about the sound of a bouncing ball. Okay? Now, I didn't really believe it. At the time I was quite sceptical, didn't believe in that kind of thing. But in particular, the people who lived in the loft room. So there was a room right at the top, right in the roof of the house, and in fact, three people used this room over the course of the 3 years that we lived there. One person every year, and each person decided that they didn't want to stay in that room after the first year that they'd lived there. So each person managed to stay in it for a year before deciding they wanted to leave. And one of the reasons was because of the sound of this strange bouncing ball that they could hear in the roof of the house. So it only happened at night, and apparently, and I did hear it myself, I did hear it a few times, which is pretty strange, but it would happen at night. You'd suddenly start to hear what sounded like a ball, like a plastic football being dropped. And the ball would bounce and then stop bouncing. So it would, if you could imagine the sound of a plastic football being dropped and just slowly coming to rest. So it was like, do, 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 like that. Okay, you're probably thinking, all right, there must be an explanation for this. And that's, in fact, what we all thought. We spent quite a lot of time talking about this, trying to work out what it was. No one ever managed to come up with a conclusive answer. We even crawled into the roof of the house in order to try and find out what was making that noise. We didn't find anything. Okay, there was no water tank up there. You might be thinking it was probably a water tank. Maybe there was a ball cock, which was a sort of valve system in a water tank, and maybe when the water drops to a certain level or rises to a certain level, it causes the plastic float, the ball cock, to knock against the roof of the water tank or something like that. Well, no, there was no water tank in there, so that's not what it was. You might be thinking maybe there was like I don't know, maybe something blowing in the wind. Maybe something in the wind sort of caused this thing to knock against the wall or something. But this would happen on evenings and nights when there was no wind. Even very calm evenings in the summer, sometimes you would hear do 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 do, the sound of this bouncing ball. It wasn't the neighbours, because there were no neighbours connected to the house. And if you were in the loft, it would wake you up. You'd be in bed sleeping, and then suddenly you'd be woken up by the sound of dang, 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 dang. And that's it. We don't know what it is. Even though we looked through the roof of the house, found nothing. I genuinely can't think of a good reason why there would be a sound. Think about it. It didn't happen every night. There was no kind of telling when it was going to happen or when it was not going to happen. It didn't happen every night. It didn't happen in certain conditions. So it didn't only happen when it was raining. It would happen sometimes when it was raining, sometimes not. It didn't just happen when it was windy. So it wasn't the wind blowing something. Sometimes it happened when there was wind. Sometimes it happened when there was no wind. Okay, all of the theories that we came up with were sort of pretty much disproved. So it's the wind blowing something, for example. Well, no, because it even happens when there's no wind. It's a water tank. It's a float in a water tank. No, there's no water tank up there. We looked through the roof of the house. We found nothing. What was the sound? What was the sound of this ball dropping? So this would really freak out the people who lived at the top. And as I said, 3 people lived in that loft and they couldn't stand it. They all moved out. I lived on the ground floor, and even I could hear this ball sometimes, which is weird because the sound would carry all the way from the loft, all the way down 3 floors to the bottom. It's almost as if when this sound was happening, that it was the loudest thing in the house, just the sound of this ball. Strange, isn't it? Now, maybe you're thinking, oh, it would have been someone in the house playing a trick. But they're not. Why would they have kept this up for 3 years? And I know my friends, and I know the way we all talked about it. I genuinely believe that no one was playing a trick. And how would they do it? Because the sound was coming from the roof. It was coming from, inside the roof. It wasn't coming from below the loft. It was coming from the roof around the loft. I don't know what that could be. Maybe, I don't know. I genuinely don't know what that was. So what do you think? Any idea about this strange bouncing ball sound? Tell me what you think.